Good afternoon, everyone. On this rainy day, hopefully the sun comes back out later in the week, but it is great to have all of you here with us. My name is James Roberson. I'm an instructional specialist for environmental literacy in Prince George's County Public Schools, and I'm also an advisory council member to the Maryland Association for Environmental and Outdoor Education, otherwise known as MAEOE. And it's my honor and pleasure to welcome you all to our third symposium focusing on diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and accessibility. For MAEOE, these are not just buzzwords. We believe that these issues are at the core of ensuring an environmentally sustainable future for all Marylanders. We are very grateful for the funding for this symposium, which is provided by the state for developing Maryland Green Schools. Today, we open the third of this four-part series with a focus on air quality and community health, which will be moderated by Dr. Mamie Parker. So I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Parker now, and she is going to introduce our guests and get us energized. So Dr. Parker, it's all you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, James, and thank you for your work for MAEOE, and I applaud MAEOE for taking this step forward to support diversity and inclusion. And it's people like you and Lisa and others, as well as Laura, that's made this something that I think is very important and brought this to the front line of your membership. So thank you for your leadership and your service. We appreciate it. I am Mamie Parker, and I am the former head of fisheries at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, a fish and wildlife biologist. However, now I serve as a success coach and have the privilege of working with a lot of great organizations, including MAEOE. So it's my pleasure to be here this afternoon, and I have the opportunity to introduce two very, very inspirational, dynamic, amazing individuals that's going to share with you all some of their knowledge that they have on a very important subject as we think about community health and as we think about air quality. And so first, I'd like to take this opportunity. I'm not going to go into detail on their bios because I would like for them to tell you more about what's important in that bio. And you can read that online too. And so we won't take a lot of time in doing that. However, our first guest is Yan Michael James Archer, and he is a PhD student at Maryland Institute for Applied Environmental Health at the University of Maryland at College Park. He's certainly inspiring and has a lot of great information to add. His heart is all about dealing with environmental justice, and he cares a lot about youth in this arena as well. And so welcome, Yan Michael. I did get it right, Yan, correct? Yan Michael, yes, thank you. And next we have Brittany Drakeford, and she is a community planner, Prince George's County Planning Commission. Again, she is a PhD student as well. So we have people that are practicing their trade, but also in academia, learning more about that. And Brittany is one of those, and she has lots of great information. If you look at her social media page, you'll see that she is an award-winning individual that's done a lot of great things and been acknowledged. And so it is my pleasure to introduce both of you all. Welcome, Brittany.
Thank you so much.
Okay, well, happy to have you here. So now I want to not only hear from you all, but we're going to ask individuals that have joined us to give us their favorite too. So first, I'm going to ask you a few questions so we can get to know you a little bit better. Favorite read or author? Favorite read or author? Is that a hard one? Who wants to go first?
That is tough for me. I'm not a huge reader. I've been reading a lot of like academic publications, and that's kind of turned me off reading in general, but I have been really big on audiobooks lately, and within that, fantasy and sci-fi. So I would have to say, well, I can't pick a favorite. What I'm reading right now and I'm enjoying is this one called where the crawdads sing about this, like this. Yeah, it's this novel, and it reads a lot like kind of young adult fiction, but I'm not mad at it. I like it.
Yeah, that's been on the bestseller list, and it was one of President Barack Obama's favorite reads of the year. So it's it's an interesting one. So Brittany, and then while Brittany is telling us about hers, you all that are joining us in the audience, practicing your chat box, tell us about your great reads or your great author. Yes, Brittany.
Yeah, so I think great authors are definitely for me going to be a tie between Paulo Coelho and then J. California Cooper. So Paulo Coelho writes a lot of spiritual books around, like, so he wrote The Alchemist, other books like Veronica Decides to Die. So when I was in undergrad, I think I sat there and I read through all of his books, and I continue to refer back to them. And then J. California Cooper, I think she does a really good job of integrating like interesting narratives about African-American life and culture. But really from the storytelling aspect. So there are a lot of like really interesting stories that pull out. So sometimes you read about African Americans and flooding, right? But it's done in a very literary perspective. So I really enjoy her work.
Her work, and it's timeless, isn't it? I mean,
it is.
You think,
and they're short stories.
right. You don't have
Which
to
is
keep on. Great stuff. Yeah. Great. Okay. So now a fun one. We're hearing in the chat box too that there are some great artists that are coming up. Megan has mentioned that Adrienne Marie Brown is one of her favorites. I've seen some others in the chat box as well. Next question. Favorite pandemic bottoms? Leggings, jeans, jogging, outfits. What would it be? Favorite pandemic bottoms?
It's been the leggings / yoga pants, certainly for me. I have never had as many as I have today. I have purchased so many, so yes.
It's gonna be a hard transition back, right? Yeah.
Very hard.
Yeah.
Especially since we're transitioning back, I don't know, like over the summer, and it's like the hottest time where you want to be wearing the least. For me, I've got these like, I don't know, from these like blue light special, like I've had them pretty much for like 10 years, maybe even longer. They're like these bright red boxing shorts or running shorts. And they're super short, kind of inappropriate, but super comfortable. And that's been my my go-to.
Wow. And we have in the chat back, wow, Chris Grant, leggings for sure. And I saw jeans in there as well. So there's a lot. I think leggings are winning from the women's perspective. And we would all love to see Jan Michael in those hot pants. So let me get a little bit more serious with you all and ask this question. The greatest fears that you have related to community health and air quality, your greatest fears.
So yeah, I think for me, this one really hits personally. I think the greatest fear that I have really looks at like the loss of intangible cultural heritage as the relationship between health and air quality. The impacts of air pollution in the built environment, it has significant impacts on health outcomes. I mean, so we can, look and see in communities in Prince George's County, for instance, in communities like Greenbelt, where there are plenty of green trees, the urban tree canopy is thriving. They have a 16-year life expectancy difference than individuals who live in communities like Stutland in Prince George's County. And so that life expectancy difference isn't just like a difference in the years of life, but that is 16 years that somebody doesn't have to spend with their family, 16 years of stories that cannot be translated, back and forth, 16 years of disruption of a community and that culture. And when we start to think about the spatialization of race and health issues, particularly as it relates to, the spatialization of health and race issues, we then start to see that there are going to be people who live in certain communities who tend to be related, maybe they're kin, or maybe they're just of the same ethnicity, who then also are experiencing some of those same conditions. So for me, I would definitely say it's like the loss of intangible cultural heritage. And I really see my work as a planner as hopefully trying to think about Afrofuturism and thinking about, societies in the future and how can we plan for our communities in the future.
Yes. I just read something about the redlining and how it's related to trees in those communities as well. when they did redlining, of course, and now you go back and they've done a map and looked at those same communities and the trees aren't there. So it's amazing to hear those conversations. Yeah, Michael, yes, greatest fear related to health and air quality.
Definitely, and I can echo a lot of what Brittany just said with regards to the fear of that loss. And I would, so on top of that, and I'm sure Brittany feels the same way, but there's also, for me, it's this very real fear of missed opportunities, and specifically for our young, young people of color with young lungs, and our, particularly, just to put it frankly, Black kids, that look like me, walk like me, talk like me. Thinking about them not having the opportunities that I had, small as they were meaningful, growing up, and being able to go to talking about redlining and the impact to green space and canopy cover, and Richmond's mapping inequality project and all that stuff. So I know how much that shaped my life, and provided, whether it was an outlet or an opportunity for curiosity and that kind of stuff, or an outlet, whether it was an outlet for frustration, being able to just run out into the woods or something like that. I know what that did for me, and we also know that kids who are not having those same opportunities are not functioning as well in school, or they have poorer health outcomes. And that's not even like a future thing. That's what we're seeing right now. So just kind of, that's one of the things that really drives me to do what I do, particularly with the green space equity stuff that I do.
Great, yeah. So next question. Your favorite artist, R&B, hip hop, or whatever, and you gotta choose between Nas. I gave you more choices there. At first it was just Tupac and Biggie Small, but now I'm adding Rihanna, Tupac, Kendrick, Lamar, or your favorite. Did I miss one? So favorite, Rihanna, her, Tupac, Kendrick, Lamar. I keep adding or Nas.
I mean, I know who I'm going for.
Who's that? Who's that?
That's Rihanna. I love her. I love her. I mean, I was thinking about that today. I mean, like this weekend, I was driving. I was just like, I love her music. I appreciate her not just for her music, but I think that there's also like this level of courageousness that she has about her. I mean, I don't know when the last time she actually released an album, but every day on Twitter, her fans are constantly like, release more music. And she's like, I'm going to go out and pursue my dreams and do whatever it is that I want to do. And I'll get back to you all when I want. So, I mean, I really love that confidence about her. And I enjoy her music because she has great dance songs. They're like good love ballads. It's a good mixture of all different types of they're good party songs. So it's a good mixture.
Wow, I just got Amanda Gorman's book, the poet laureate from the inauguration, and she talks about being brave enough to be it, and that's what that reminds me of when you talk about Rihanna and how brave she is and strong enough to do it, right?
Yeah, I mean, and she's been faced with a lot of adversities, especially publicly, and I mean, just how she was able to deal with it and how she's handled it, and So I mean, I love her approach to feminism.
Great, thank you so much. Yeah, Michael. Your time.
I feel like I can't top that, or nor do I even really want to, but I do feel the need to say something different. So after Rihanna, I will say, I'll bring it back to PG County in DC area. There's this rapper named Odyssey, who's been underground forever, but he's in his lane and he's in his bag and he knows what he's doing and he does it really well. And that's kind of just my well that I always go back to whenever I'm in any kind of funk. I put on some Odyssey. The Beauty and All is my favorite album by him. He did a lot of he was a producer first. He did a lot of beats and stuff, and then when he started rapping, it was phenomenal. But he's really cool. He's a PG County native.
Homeboy. All
Yeah.
right, in the chat box, you can put any of your favorite artists that you have in the chat box. We'll hear from you. There's Lorraine. Welcome, Lorraine. You can add yours if you have one. June, any of you all that are on. Here's somebody who likes chat. All right, Otis Redding. Some of us are going way back to the midnight hour. All right. The next question, and this is the last question. The song that you would say that you would play as it relates to air quality, community health, Celebration or I Will Survive?
Definitely not Celebration.
No?
No, well, and I think there are reasons to celebrate. The Biden administration has been doing a lot to undo a lot of the BS mandates and restrictions or loosening of restrictions that happened in the last 4 years. So that's cause for celebration, albeit grudgingly, because we shouldn't have to be celebrating that in the first place. But I think it would be more so along the lines of I Will Survive. And actually even, and I'll double down on that because, there is a lot of fear attached to, what are we going to do? The climate, the IPCC says we only had 12 years ago, and that was what, 4 years ago, 3 years ago? Or they said we had 12 years to go until, a cataclysm. And that clock is still ticking. So I resonate with at first I was lost. I was petrified or terrified,
Yes.
but we will survive one way or another. And I think it'll definitely take dramatic action, dramatic discomfort, dramatic inconvenience for a lot of us, for everyone. But we will survive. We have to, right?
Mm-hmm.
We have to find a way. And if you're taking a global look, a lot of other countries are doing the work, and we need to hold our legislators and our representatives feet to the fire, to join that charge.
Great. Thank you. All right, Brittany, last one.
Yeah.
Celebration or I Will Survive?
I mean, I would also say I will survive. I mean, and I think about it from the perspective of resilience. So there's I believe it stems from a Mexican saying, Mexican proverb around, they tried to bury us, but they didn't know we were seeds. And so when I think about the resilience, particularly in African-American communities, or even just communities that have been historically marginalized, so not just African-American communities, we can think about indigenous populations, Latinx populations, populations across the globe who have been, marginalized in a variety of different ways. They have exhibited a unique sense of resilience in the face of so many different atrocities. And so I can see I will survive because that is like our mantra, no matter what is, and yes, they are, bad situations that are thrown at us, but there's a level of survival and honestly, really interesting techniques and methods that if researchers and scholars took a deeper look into could really be used to better build out global sustainability in some instances.
Wow. So hearing that and talking to you all, not just today, but in our last conversation, I know that you inspire all of us to survive. And I know that you have some stories that you can tell us as to how you all have survived too. So thank you for sharing all those. I had one more about whether or not you'd rather live in a tree house, a cave, or a she shed, or a man's cave. But I'll save that till the end in case we have time for that one. Tree house, cave, or a she shed, or the man cave. But we'll move on now. And I just want you guys to just tell us, how did you get where you are? We want to hear about your journey. And as you know, this is more like StoryCorps. So tell me a story. Pretend you are telling us a story about yourselves. And we'll give you all about 10 minutes each to tell us where you are and how did you get to where you are and what inspired you to, or whoever inspired you to get there. So I'll throw out all that for you to.
Yeah, do you want to go or?
Sure, I'll go. So I grew up. I'm one of two children of West Indian parents. My parents are from Guyana. They came over here in the 80s. Worked on several floors of the World Trade Center. From from the bottom to top. And I kind of, so I have that like immigrant hustle kind of pushing me, and throughout my life growing up, I've kind of had that to lean back on, or to look back at as a model for the things that I do and the effort that I put forth. But I grew up in Georgia, Stone Mountain, Georgia. Someone said Childish Gambino was their favorite rapper or favorite artist, and Childish Gambino also has roots to Stone Mountain. And he has a line about, like, you know, growing up where Confederates stared hard as hell. And that's because in Stone Mountain, Georgia, for those of you who don't know, there's this huge monument, probably the world's largest, other than maybe parts of the US Constitution. This is the world's largest monument to racism. And so I grew up in that kind of area, in that context of you know, the old South and the white South. And I moved around a lot as a kid, but I always kind of came back to just knowing, being very, very aware, critically aware of kind of my race and the race of others, you know. And so that kind of also guided me through high school and through college, of, like, you know, where I went to a predominantly white institution, University of Tampa. And so, you know, my performance, I felt like, you know, I was definitely kind of working with what I had, but also I had this obligation to do well, you know, to do well, not just for me, not just for my parents, but just for the folks that might come after me. That's when I kind of got into community service and doing a lot of stuff outside of the school, after school, doing like education. I worked with one of the first kind of interactions I did with environmental education was this after school program for a Title I school. And it really kind of blew me away, because here were kids that just had lots of stuff going on in their lives, but for 1 to 2 hours at the end of every day, they came here and all they wanted to know about was science, and all they wanted to do was science. And regardless of what barriers they had kind of set in their path, or what barriers that I overcame and I might have applied to them, all I saw was nothing but potential. And so when I finished my college and when I finished graduate school, I was like, I want to go into environmental education. And I came up here because I got a job with the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service as an intern, and they paid for my housing. So I was like, all right, going to work for the feds. And this was in 2016, when everything about working for the environment kind of took a pause. But it was a great experience. But one thing that I recognized almost instantly was that the organizations that I worked for and with were not necessarily highlighting diversity and inclusion of particularly Black communities in the outreach and the work that they were doing. Despite the labels of the program, and I won't get specific and all this stuff, but like, I just felt like they weren't really living up to the charge and to the call. And so I sought kind of other opportunities to get engaged with these communities of color and doing more environmental work. I bounced around to a couple different organizations. And after a while of bouncing, I was like, you know what, I feel like I can do more. I like environmental education. It doesn't pay enough, but I don't know exactly how much impact and how much change I can make from doing my little seasonal jobs from season to season. So that's what kind of pushed me to go back to school and study environmental justice, because this is something that even though I hadn't really known the term environmental justice up until a few years, or like a year before I started my program at the School of Public Health, I knew that these were the issues that I wanted to face and I wanted to address. And so that's what brought me to the University of Maryland and working with Dr. Jacoby Wilson, ultimately working on these air quality projects. And one of my major things right now is low cost community science air quality monitoring. So let me break that down. The low cost is a function of EPA and all the state agencies. They have mandates to do air quality monitoring, right? But because of the high cost of these monitoring technology and the processes and the methodologies, they only do that monitoring kind of to the extent that the budgets will allow. And in some cases, like in the state of Maryland, we've got maybe between 20 and 30 federal monitoring locations, like high quality, super expensive, like state-of-the-art equipment, gold standard equipment in the state. We've only got maybe 30 of those monitors in the state. And so you don't get full coverage, and you especially don't get good coverage in communities of color, where you're seeing, like we had talked about earlier with segregation and redlining, where these communities have been almost set up to fail and been set up to have these polluting industries and infrastructure, whether it's highways, whether it's concrete block plants in the port towns, whether it's power plants. They've almost been set up to kind of be greenlit for those permits to land right on top of them in these Black communities. And so what we do.
Can you just define redlining? Because I thought about it. Some people may not know what that even means. You know?
Sure, absolutely. So the Homeowners Loan Corporation back in the early, I think it ended in the 1940s or 1950s, but prior to that, basically they graded neighborhoods based on how many Black people, how many immigrants were in the area, you know, the wealth of the area, and they graded it on a scale from like A to D. And the worst category was indicated by the color red. And so these were areas typically that had a lot of African American folks, a lot of other people of color, other immigrants. And this is where and then you also couldn't get a loan if you were in those groups. And yeah, I mean, Brittany is the one to talk about. She's the one to talk to redlining.
Yeah, well then I'll let you wrap up, and then we'll move on to Brittany, but go ahead and finish your life
For
story.
Sure. Yeah, so long story short, I'm all about empowering community members to collect their own data and seek their own change, you know, through legislative action, through policy action. So what we do is we work with communities to set up air quality monitoring networks that don't break the bank. And we train community members how to use them, how to analyze the data, and then how to take that data and turn it into action, how to, you know, work with legislators and legal staffers, legal aides to say, okay, here's my data. Now, what are you going to do with it? Regulator, enforcer, you guys are supposed to be taking, you know, you're collecting your own data. Let's compare our data, because what I'm seeing is injustice, to put it bluntly. So that's what I do. That's kind of who I am and where I am now.
Hey, thank you for sharing that. What a journey. And we crossed each other at U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Yes, Brittany, your turn. Give us about 10 minutes or less, and
Okay.
Not a lot of time to condense all of your life stories. I know you can give us some highlights.
No, definitely. So, so for me, I think my relationship starts in Prince George's County. So this is hopefully, you know, soon this will be part of my dissertation research. But my family is from Prince George's County. So I've worked as a historian for the county's Black History program. And so I can actually trace my ancestry back in Prince George's County to just before the Civil War. So my ancestry traces back to basically enslavement in Prince George's County. And interestingly, we believe through some documentation that my family, the plantation where my family was enslaved, is actually still standing. And is actually has been recently restored in pretty good condition. So that's where my history starts for me. So I always start my journey there, because it's definitely just connected with this practice of Prince George's County. And so growing up in Prince George's County, sixth generation, you know, resident of the county, I constantly was hanging out with my mother and my grandmother, and we would drive around the entire county, because my mother and my grandmother, they love to go shopping. And so we would just hang out every Sunday, or every week, Saturdays, Mondays, whatever day you can think of, we would hang out together. And so as we were driving around, there would be times when my grandmother would point out places. Oh, this is where the neighborhood that used to flood, or this is where we grew up and they used to flood here, or this is where the family land was. And so I would just always remember that and keep that in the back of my head. But then when I was 17, my mother actually passed away of heart failure as a result of complications due to sarcoidosis. And sarcoidosis is an autoimmune deficiency disorder that causes inflammation of the soft tissue organs. So like the skin, lungs, heart, eyes. And so my mother actually had pulmonary sarcoidosis, which impacted her lungs, and then also later impacting her heart. And so she had this for almost the entirety of my life while she was living. And basically this caused a lot of different like challenges. But she was, again, thinking about those seeds who were buried. She continued to like blossom and thrive anyway. But, you know, when she was first diagnosed with sarcoidosis, or prior to being diagnosed with sarcoidosis, the doctors had absolutely no idea. They accused her of like being on, of like using substance abuse. They accused her of all different types of things. So when we talk about like COVID, like reasons why communities are skeptical, like right there, that's just like an example of like medical discrimination, right? And so here was this young woman. And so basically there were all these different factors that they were trying to figure out what it is. Doctors really didn't understand how people developed or acquired the disease. But now, you know, almost 20, 30 years later, more and more research is starting to come out that's showing that one, you know, there's a disparity in the diagnoses of sarcoidosis. So African Americans are 3 times more likely to develop the disease and to also develop symptoms from the disease that require hospital visits. But there's a stronger and stronger correlation between pollution in neighborhoods, air pollution, and, you know, in this autoimmune disease. And so the reality is that the neighborhoods that my mother grew up in, growing up in Southeast Washington, D.C., growing up in different parts of Prince George's County, that is likely what triggered and exacerbated the granulization of these cells in her lungs. And so ever since my mom passed away, I had constantly been on this journey to try to figure out, I mean, some kind of reason as to like why this happened. And so that's basically for me where this story starts, is like in this built environment in Prince George's County, the connections with slavery and enslavement, and then this issue that my mother had. So then as I started to go out to school, I studied anything that wasn't urban planning because I didn't even understand of the concept of urban planning until I started officially working for the planning department. I might have known it a little bit before then, but I didn't make the connections. So I studied African American history and journalism, really pulling in some of those investigation skills. I worked with a local arts-based organization where I did placemaking with youth. Then I ended up moving back to the DC area to do some policy organization with a youth engagement group called the Port Towns Youth Council, when we did work around pedestrian safety for young people in communities inside the Beltway of Prince George's County, which are the communities that are typically seen as communities that are under-resourced or underestimated. And so for me, that's really where this relationship starts, is trying to understand. So when I talk about the loss of life, for me, it's a very personal connection, that we have people who are experiencing our places every day, who some of them may be academics, some of them may be professionals, some of them are just, you know, regular people on the street who have had their lives disrupted, really because of no fault of their own, but because of how our communities have been designed. And so that community design is really important. And so a lot of the work that I do looks at how do we rebuild communities, and not just rebuilding communities, how do we help regenerate communities? How do we leverage communities for themselves so that they can transform themselves from the inside out, and not necessarily have to always rely on external support, external resources to get the things that they need in place.
Wow, what a story both of you all have. And did you all know each other? Have you all crossed each other's path before?
We
have. we took classes together. The University of Maryland connected us. Yeah, but we might have met before then, right?
We met before that. I heard you speak at one of our symposia, so one of the annual symposia that we put together. I think this was even before I kind of had an instrumental role in like planning these events, which is a lot more trouble. Now it's exactly as much trouble as it's worth, and it's worth a lot. But I got to hear you speak, Brittany, about planning and kind of what you do. And then we kind of crossed paths again through school.
Yeah.
Any messages for either of you? Do you have anything you want to say to each other? Now you have that option before we move into Q&As from our audience, and we'll talk more about making changes and how you address changes. How do we address this system itself and the disparities in it?
So I have learned a ton from you. I'll just start there. This has been I mean, from really, starting from our course at the University of Maryland with Dr. Jacoby to the Black Communities Conference. I mean, you're a wealth of knowledge. I mean, I know we've had conversations around just perseverance, thinking about communities. And I think the scientific, so I'm very much more of like a qualitative storytelling. I could sit here and tell y'all stories for days. But I really do appreciate your quantitative aspect and really looking in your passion and your drive for community. I mean, I think that is something that not many people have and not many people carry forth. And I think that you do a really good job of being able to navigate both the academic sphere and then also like the community sphere. So I think that's like truly inspirational of how you're able to really wear, not just one hat, but like multiple hats.
I don't even know. I'm not even hearing what you're saying, because everything you're saying, I'm like, but you are so much better at it. Because let me tell you guys. So Brittany is super active in her own community. The shade earlier about Greenbelt, well deserved. We got a lot of trees, especially here in I'm close to old Greenbelt, where got a lot of trees and a lot of hot air. But Brittany is super active in her own community, applying kind of the things that she's learning at the university and doing at work into her own community organizing and activity. And not only that, she's just got so much style and, I like dramatics. Like we worked together on a project, the dreaded group project, and Brittany, like, for not being able, because she works and because she does all this other stuff, she wasn't really able to make all these project meetings, but she always had a product that was just stunning and like visually appealing, and I couldn't get over it. So I am definitely a fan of yours, Brittany. Not just you're not just a colleague, you're kind of an idol to me, because you are doing the work.
Oh, wow.
Literally. I'm learning about it, I'm telling other people about the work, but you're doing the work.
Yeah.
Cool.
And I asked this question because we know that 65% of Americans did not receive any recognition, praising, or recognition in the workplace last year. And so sometimes we have to build each other up too. And Brittany, one of the things that I hear, someone's appreciating your word choices. That's Megan Fink. And she says that you're using the word she said not just under-resourced, but underestimated. And that's all about celebrating what's right in the world, right? You want to speak more to that?
Yeah, that was actually a term that my sister and I started playing around with like last week. Because we, so one of the other side projects that I work on, I help organize a farmer's market in Capitol Heights. And a lot of times when we first started the market, there were a lot of challenges around trying to find farmers and business partners, because people thought that, these communities aren't going to be profitable. And so last year, so in 2020, in the middle of the pandemic, we operated the market, and the market was very successful. For like the third year of a farmer's market, we were able to generate, our farm partners and business partners were able to generate about $60,000 in 15 market days, which is, for us, that was great, right? And when we did the calculations, those calculations almost equaled the amount of money that a traditional grocery store would have generated within the same time period from the actually hourly perspective. And so that made us realize, like, our communities are not like, they're not under-resourced. We have all of the resources that we need, but people are underestimating the value that our communities actually have, whether that be our music, whether that is our culture, whether that is even like the financial capital that we have, right? So people are constantly underestimating those resources. And so really finding new ways to change our language to be more intentional, to think about, what does it mean if a community is underestimated versus a community being underserved, right? Like, how do we see that as a difference, or under-resourced versus underestimated? So really trying to like just build it out from that perspective.
And not make it something, like you said, inferior, under, right? Under. Yes, yeah, Michael, question for you. You mentioned, did you want to elaborate further on what Brittany's saying?
I just wanted to say that, right there, you got an example of just Brittany's brilliance, and just, oh my gosh.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that.
I
And
wanted to ask you all, now we'll get into the audience. Audience, you can start putting your questions in the chat, but as we move forward, I want you to think about, these are educators, and what are some of the things that they can do, because a lot of what could happen is going to be in the hands of, you know, future generations, but also teachers. You know, I think about my 9th grade teacher. He was the one that introduced me to Marvin Gaye's song, Mercy Me, things are not like they used to be. And he talked about radiation in our air and mercury in the fish we eat. So educators are the ones that are going to make a difference. So you guys want to kind of tie this into education and talk about solutions and what the educators can do. You want to go first, yeah, Michael, or? Yeah,
Sure, sure, I can go first. First of all, thanks to all of the educators on the call and, you know, across the country. I think we've all been able to watch a little more clearly the struggles of teaching, the teaching profession and education in general. Those of us on the outside of it anyway. So very grateful for the work that you all did before the pandemic and soldiered on through the pandemic, and hopefully we'll see it on the other end of the pandemic as well. Yeah, in terms of where to go with this and how to apply this to education, I think one of the most important things that kids can learn is, or I mentioned learning by doing earlier on the call, and also learning by seeing. It's not as catchy, but like, you know, just exposure. So exposing kids to these radical ideas, well, radical, right? You know, when we're talking about cutting carbon emissions and all these different rollbacks and all these different environmental changes and all of this stuff, I'm sure all of, I mean, I don't even really know, because I know some educators, and I know that they're doing really fantastic things. So maybe what I should do is kind of highlight what I'm already seeing. So some of the educators that I'm friends with, and I'm fortunate enough to kind of talk to on a regular basis, they are constantly using kind of some of these controversial topics in the news, and some of the things that I would have thought would be like, oh, that's too not highbrow, but that's kind of too upper level for elementary or middle school or something like that, and really distilling it down. So I mentioned like only having 12 years from the IPCC rating, right? So I had a friend who brought into their class, okay, so where will you all be in the next 12 years? And then broke it down in terms of like, this is one way we can go in terms of if we make these changes, and if we don't make these changes, this is how it's going to go. And it got kind of dark, and I was like, whoa, but that resonated, right? And it made things real. And I'm not saying that anyone on this call is doing this, but we definitely don't need to like hide the truth or the reality from students today. I think that that underestimates them. Is going back to what Brittany is saying. It underestimates what they can rise to, right? And the same thing goes for all the conversations that we're having about police brutality, systemic racism, and climate justice, climate racism, environmental racism. These are all things that need to be discussed in classrooms early, so that you know, when you have a captive audience, and before kind of, in a way, this might be wrong to say, but kind of before kids can form opinions that are informed by nonsense, you know, before that, because they're such sponges, and you know, I wish someone had talked to me about anti-Blackness as a kid. I really do, especially going through everything that I did with regards to feeling like I was wearing the race on my shoulders, you know, and conformity. And so I definitely want for everyone on the call to know that you can definitely bring up these topics and take some risks, be brave, take some risks about, you know, what the backlash might be. I'll be there for you. Just give me a call. I'll put my email in the chat. I'll defend you. But definitely the kids need to be exposed.
Yes, thank you. Let's see if we have any questions from the audience. Any questions? Any comments? Questions to these individuals? Where can we find data on health outcomes? We have that question from, yes, Ms. Cook, Mr. Cook or Ms. Cook? Question
Yeah.
on data.
Thanks, Ms. Cook. There's a really great resource called the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation 500 Cities project. And the reason it's really, there's CDC, there's your local health department, there are all these things, but I feel like private foundations and nonprofits, they just have a really good eye on like designing visual graphics that make sense, the first time you see it. You don't have to really pour into it. So Robert Wood Johnson Foundation does a really great job of that. Gates Foundation does a really great job of that. So I would definitely start there. It's RWJF 500 Cities project.
Okay, there's another question. I'll throw this one at you, Brittany, if you can, from Megan. And she wants to know any books or organizations and suggestions related to rewilding community spaces.
I'll have to think about that. I mean, it's just some organizations that, I participate in. So organizations like Outdoor Afro, that's been for me, that's been a space where I can just find, space in, exploring, the outdoors. Another book that I don't know if this is necessarily around the rewilding community spaces, but I read this book and it helped me, rethink and or at least challenge my thoughts around like water and the relationship is Janisa Wardy's book called oh goodness, it's Water and African American Memory. Mm-hmm. And it's like the book basically explores the relationship between swamps, like the swamps, rivers, the ocean, and thinking about African American history and really rooting like this relationship between water for African Americans, particularly of descendants of slavery, with like this the Middle Passage and the transatlantic slave trade, and then even just thinking about how people would have to navigate through water for navigating through the water for attempting to like gain freedom in those different aspects. So I think that's been another interesting book for me. I'll think about it some more and see if I can come up with some more recommendations.
So I actually have. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was saying anyone that's in the audience, if you have some recommendations, put those in the chat box as well. Go ahead, Jan Michael.
So this actually on my desk, I picked this up last week. So this is a response to the Green New Deal that some coalition of indigenous authors has put together in terms of what we can do to kind of not only prepare for climate change or, hopefully reverse the damages that are bringing us towards this climate disaster, but also do so equitably and justly with regards to indigenous communities. So it's called the Red Deal. And this is one of those like radical things. There's a lot of things in here that I am experiencing and seeing for the first time. But there are ideas that I'm like, that's not something I would have heard unless I had gone to the indigenous community for that perspective. So going along with what Brittany's saying about expanding, your worldview, I think that's definitely one that I'll plug, the Red Deal.
Red Deal. Yeah. And we've just been introduced to this equitable collaboration here in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and they're doing it in Maryland too. And they talk about the principles of that. And I highly recommend we all look at those because it talks about truth seeking, talked about being adaptive. Of course, we know it's going to mean inclusion and being responsive, but it also talks about trauma informed. So when we think about our educators, and they're sitting down at the table, and we're thinking about collaborating with others, whether or not it's on community health or if it's on air quality. Think about some of the people that are sitting there that have experienced trauma and what they're bringing to the table and how they're bringing it to how their conversation will make a difference, or how they speak will make a difference, and how we treat them will make a difference. So I just throw that in. Yes, Brittany.
No, I think that's a really great point. One of the courses that I took at the University of Maryland with Professor Ariel Bierbaum is a school policy. So it's an education policy. So the intersection between public schools and urban planning. And we really talked about the relationship between schools being a sites of trauma for African American children or even other children of color. I mean, from everything from busing. Sometimes like I was a product of busing. I ended up being bused about 2 hours back and forth each day. So that being an instance of trauma. Sometimes being in schools where the teachers don't necessarily understand you, or they might have preconceived conceptions. I had a teacher who was very surprised when she found out that my father lived in the household with us. So, so all of these different ways that children, where school sites themselves are the sites of trauma for children, and really thinking about how we can look at trauma-informed care to make that a more inclusive or a site of healing for students. I think is also important. Just around some of the things that people can do, or educators. I'm going to plug. Connect with your local planning department. I mean, if you're in Prince George's County, I would love to connect with you because students, we can really use place as a form of pedagogy, and students are young people are intuitively connected to the built environment and how it impacts them. The reason why we were able to, when I was working with the Port Towns Youth Council, while we were able to get 50, 60 young people organizing a protest around pedestrian safety, is because they have to walk everywhere, right? So they understand what it looks like when your neighborhood doesn't have sidewalks. They're outside, they're enjoying these spaces. And they're also the people who essentially, hopefully, we're building our communities for. So something that I would love to do, in my role, is just building more relationships with the elementary, middle, and high schools. And I already have some programs. So I have some booklets to hand out and pass out to y'all if you want to use them as a way to build some of those connections.
Great. So Bernie Smith has asked a question back on air quality, and you mentioned earlier about in the past conversation, radiation in the air. Are communities concerned about radiation or the electromagnetic radiation or even electric pollution from all of these electronic devices? Are you seeing any of that data or any results from that, Jan Michael, in your studies?
So in terms of the perceptions about it or the concern, it's an interesting phenomenon. I have only ever, and Bernice, not attributing anything to you one way or another, but I've only ever heard of that concern coming from white people. And it's interesting because because obviously it's a huge issue, right? And it's definitely deserving of, concern. But I've never heard, except 5G, all the memes and all of the the 5G stuff kind of blew up. But for because I used to work right next to these huge power lines. I forget what it's called, but these big power lines. And people would always kind of come up concerned like, hey, how does that affect the birds? How is that affecting the wildlife? And it was never anyone kind of in my community in Black folks. And I've kind of always wondered why, but haven't gotten the answer yet. That being said, I do throw it in people's faces because a lot of speaking about medical distrust and reason, and the valid reasoning for medical mistrust. But with that on one side, and on the other side, we got to get vaccinated, y'all. So I do, when I have some conspiracy friends come at me with some anti-vaccine stuff, I'm like, yeah, but you're totally happy to wear these Bluetooth headphones and all this stuff, and you wear these things every single day. You haven't devoted any research to that, but you know everything about the vaccine after 2 YouTube videos. Get out of here, man.
So, Brittany, we could not have this conversation, both of you all, without talking about incinerators in Baltimore. And is that a subject that's off the table, or your thoughts on that? Either one of you all.
I mean, I know you and Michael's research focuses on that a little more than mine. So I would, if you want to, touch on that.
You want to?
Sure. No, I'm happy to. So incinerators are bad they're just bad all around. They're not renewable energy. They're not waste to energy. They're bad for communities. They're bad for the environment. They have no business existing. They create dirty jobs. I have strong opinions on incinerators.
Okay.
We need jobs, but we need clean jobs, and that goes to the whole coal industry.
Good. Okay, believe it or not, our time is up. I cannot believe that it's gone this
I
fast.
can't either.
Wait, I gotta make sure. Yeah.
Mamie, I have to plug something actually. When you asked about favorite books, if I was a better politician, I would have said this one. I don't know if you recognize it, but this is a highlight feature by the Smithsonian Anacostia Community Museum. It features incredible African American and people of color scientists, scientists and activists, including Dr. Mamie Parker.
Oh.
And I just got it yesterday. I'm super thrilled to read it, and I'm going to try and get a few more copies for friends and family. But speaking of, getting praise, this isn't particularly the workplace, but you have definitely been a light and a beacon and a leader in this field. And specifically, when I was in Fish and Wildlife Service, and I was like, why aren't there more people like her? Why I got to mess around with you guys? But no, thank you for everything that you've done.
Thank you too. I appreciate it. Final thoughts, Brittany. You get to final thoughts, and then I'll give you the last word. Yeah, Michael. Anything you wanted to make sure you covered in this session, and one thing you want to make sure that it's a take home to our audience.
Yeah, so I mean, certainly I would look at, again, I cannot reiterate more the importance of connecting with your local policy around this. So connecting with your planning agencies, your public works administration as a way to help to operationalize these conversations around equity in the built environment, equity in the environment in general. And to really then figure out how we can connect young people to that political process. So young people have amazing voices, and people, they when you get shamed by a young person, you have to.
Different.
It does. And so really helping them navigate that political process and getting them involved in that process very early, I think is really key to really seeing some of these long-term systematic and systemic changes that we want to see, because they do have so much power, they have so much creativity, and they can really tell these stories in ways that we couldn't even imagine. And they have a bunch of resources and technology at their disposal that I don't even know how to use. But I think really bringing them into the conversation, I think is great when thinking about equity and community health.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah, my final thoughts, comments.
This isn't something that I came here to say, but I think it's come up organically, and I just want to roll with it. Taking from our icon Rihanna, just be brave. When you're doing something and you ask yourself, and you don't have to do this all the time, but ask yourself, what I'm doing right now with regards to this policy or this lesson plan, am I being brave right now? Am I going outside of what might be expected of me? Am I going to make anyone uncomfortable? And if not, maybe find a way to do those things, to push envelopes and to go a little bit further and advance discussions in directions and in depth in ways that they wouldn't have gone unless you were to make yourself, to ask yourself if you're being brave in that moment. And I think that's one small step that we all can take. We can look down into our core and see, who we really are, and see how what we're doing can impact the grand scheme of things by being brave.
Being brave.
Like Rihanna. Be like Rihanna.
So I really appreciate it. We heard some wonderful things from you all that were inspiring to people like me. And I see Megan and others are saying thank you. Impact I can make, underestimated. Take the risk, be brave. I'll be there. That's a strong one. Both of you all have offered that to your participants. Make the connections, not only with your planning commission in the departments, but also build relationships and build warriors, build advocates that can go in and advocate for themselves when it comes to community health and air quality. Those are some strong messages that I got out of today. There were some others, but we really appreciate it. And when I think about you all, I think about this where it says, hello to me. You guys were awesome, and I appreciate it. So now I'm going to turn it back over to Mayo to close us out. And we're just a little bit over, James, but I think it was worth every bit of it to hear from this great panel.
Absolutely. I'm sorry that it has to end. I've really enjoyed listening to all of you for the hour. It really did fly by. And it's at the end of the day, and we're all still looking at a screen, but I was just captivated. So I want to thank you both. I scribbled down, underestimated. That really struck with me in the Be Brave. So thank you. And as I introduced myself in the beginning, I work in Prince George's County and I spend time over here, and I feel so fortunate that you're both connected. So that's great. So thank you for the work you're doing. But let me close us out. I want to thank Dr. Parker for setting today's tone for today's event. She was our moderator, and our very inspirational, informative guests, Jan Michael Archer and Brittany Dakeford. And we thank each of you for spending your valuable time with us.